I never thought I would be the kind of woman to be blindsided in my own living room, my hands trembling while my husband shoved papers at me like he was winning some cruel game. But there I was, frozen on the edge of the couch, staring at the divorce documents that would erase the last 4 years of my life. "I don't need you anymore," Evan said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "Dad's estate is worth $450 million. I'm set for life. You were just a placeholder until now." The words hit like a punch to the gut. My father-in-law had been gone less than a week. I was still walking through the house, half expecting to hear his slow, warm laugh drifting from his study. The grief was fresh, raw. And here was Evan, his only son, gloating over an inheritance like it was a lottery ticket, acting as if the man who raised him was nothing more than a bank account waiting to be unlocked. I felt heat rise in my chest, a swirl of heartbreak and disgust. In the back of my mind, an image of Richard's face came to me. His tired eyes, the way he'd look at Evan sometimes, as though silently asking, "When will you grow up?" My fists tightened in my lap. I wanted to yell, to tell Evan exactly what I thought of this smug, selfish version of the man I'd once loved. But instead, I heard Richard's voice in my memory. Calm, measured. "Clara, some storms you don't fight in the middle. You wait for the right wind." I took a slow breath, letting my shoulders drop. Without a word, I held out my hand for the papers. Evan smirked, clearly convinced he'd crushed me. I scanned the signature line and signed. My pen barely made a sound, but inside something shifted, like a lock turning. "File them yourself," I said, pushing the papers back across the table. My voice was steady, almost cold. "And send my things when you're done." Evan's grin faltered just for a moment before returning like he'd imagined the whole thing. I stood, walked past him, and grabbed my purse from the entryway table. My heels clicked against the hardwood floors as I stepped out into the damp Savannah air. The Whitfield house loomed behind me. 3 stories of brick and old Southern pride. It had once felt warm and alive when Richard was here. Now, it was just walls and shadows. The wind off the river smelled of salt and rain. I didn't look back. Evan thought he'd just won the life jackpot. What he didn't know was that the $450 million he was counting on wasn't what he thought it was. Not even close. And I was the only one who knew the truth. 4 years earlier, my life had already been split clean in 2, before the accident and after. Before, I was married to Michael, a civil engineer who loved bridge designs so much he could talk for hours about the curve of a suspension cable or the exact shade of paint on a truss. We didn't have much, just a modest house, 2 rescue dogs, and plans to start a family once we'd saved a little more. He was my safe place, my steady current in a world that felt unpredictable. After came on a Tuesday morning in early spring, when my phone rang while I was in the middle of a client pitch. I remember my assistant's pale face as she held the phone out to me, her lips moving but my ears already roaring. There'd been a collapse at one of Michael's sites, a faulty support beam. He was gone before the ambulance arrived. The days after were a blur of casseroles, flowers, and the heavy silence of a home that no longer had his laugh in it. The life insurance settlement and the state's workplace compensation felt like blood money. $500,000 I would have burned in a heartbeat if it could have brought him back. Michael's parents, kind and soft-spoken, insisted I keep it all. "You're still young, Clara. Make a new start," his mother told me, squeezing my hand through her own tears. For a long time, I didn't know what to do with myself. I threw myself into my work, climbing the ladder at the marketing firm, managing events for big-name clients. The busier I kept, the less I had to sit in my empty house and remember how quiet it had become. It was at a hospitality industry conference in Atlanta that I first met Evan Whitfield. He wasn't supposed to be there. He admitted as much over cocktails. "Crashing on behalf of a friend," he'd said with a grin that was equal parts boyish and mischievous. He made me laugh in a way I hadn't in months. Not polite, surface-level chuckles, but the kind that surprised me. Coming from somewhere deep I thought had gone dark forever. Over the next few days, we crossed paths constantly. In line for coffee, in the hotel lobby, even at the rooftop bar where he bought me a drink, for surviving another day of schmoozing. He told me he'd been helping his father since a downturn in his own business, but didn't offer many details. When I pressed, he'd shrug it off with, "Nothing exciting. Dad just needs a hand around the place." Looking back, I can see the omissions. The way he changed the subject when I asked about work. How his stories about clients were vague. But at the time, I took it as humility. After all, wasn't it better to have someone who valued family over career? When the conference ended, he asked for my number. Our calls turned into weekend visits into weekday dinners. By the time he suggested I meet his father, it felt like the next natural step. I didn't know it then, but meeting Richard Whitfield would change everything. Not because of Evan, but because of the bond that man and I would share, one that Evan could never understand. It was a warm September afternoon when Evan drove us down the live oak line driveway to the Whitfield estate. The air smelled faintly of salt from the river nearby, and the cicadas buzzed like a steady undercurrent to my thoughts. I'd been nervous the whole ride. Evan had mentioned his father in passing, but never in detail. The house itself looked like it belonged on the cover of a Southern architecture magazine. 3 stories of red brick and white columns, wide wraparound porches shaded by magnolia trees. It was stately, but not flashy. A home that had been cared for, not just displayed. Inside, the cool air carried the scent of polished wood and something warm from the kitchen. Richard Whitfield was waiting in the library, seated in a high-backed leather chair with a book resting open in his lap. "Dad, this is Clara," Evan announced a little too casually. Richard closed the book and stood slowly, his movements deliberate but strong for a man in his late 70s. His handshake was firm, his eyes sharp and assessing, but there was warmth there too. "I've heard you're the reason my son's been smiling lately," he said with a faint grin. I felt the tension in my shoulders ease. "It's good to finally meet you, Mr. Whitfield." "Richard," he corrected gently. "Mr. Whitfield makes me feel like I should be at a board meeting." We sat together in the library while Evan wandered off to take a phone call. It didn't take long for Richard to start asking about my work. Real questions, not polite filler. "Marketing in this climate can't be easy. Are you focusing on retention or expansion?" I blinked, surprised. Most people's eyes glazed over when I talked about client acquisition strategies. But Richard leaned in, genuinely interested, even offering a few insights from his own decades in the boutique hotel business. It wasn't just business talk, though. He asked about my family, my late husband, and listened without interrupting. There was no pity in his eyes, just understanding. Evan returned halfway through our conversation, looking bored. "Dad, you're talking shop again," he complained. Richard's gaze lingered on me for a moment before he answered his son. "Some of us enjoy hearing how people make their way in the world." Dinner that evening was simple. Roast chicken, fresh vegetables from the garden, cornbread still warm from the oven. Richard insisted we eat at the long dining table. No phones, no distractions. He told stories about traveling to coastal towns, restoring historic hotels, and how he'd once turned a failing property into a thriving retreat by focusing on community events instead of luxury perks. When I complimented his ingenuity, he shrugged. "Money's a tool, Clara. It's not the goal. Build something that matters and the money follows." That night, as Evan and I left, Richard walked us to the door. His voice lowered just enough that Evan, already halfway to the car, couldn't hear. "You've got a good head on your shoulders. Don't let my boy drag you down." I didn't know what to make of it at the time. But later, I'd realize it was the first quiet warning of many. For the first few weeks after I moved into the Whitfield estate, Evan seemed to play the role of the dutiful son. He woke early, brought his father coffee, ran errands, and talked about finally making things right. I wanted to believe this was real, that maybe he just needed a chance to prove himself. But little by little, the mask slipped. By the end of the first month, mornings often began with Evan still in bed long after I'd left for work. When I came home, I'd find him sprawled on the couch, controller in hand, a half-empty beer sweating on the coffee table. The errands he claimed to be running turned out to be long afternoons at the marina with his buddies. One Thursday evening, I opened my banking app and froze. Nearly $15,000 was gone from my savings account. A closer look made my stomach drop. A luxury watch boutique in Charleston, a high-end stereo system from an electronics store, and a deposit on what looked like a small yacht rental. When I confronted him, Evan waved it off. "Come on, Clara, it's just a few things. I've been taking care of Dad full-time. Don't I deserve to enjoy myself a little?" That's not your money to enjoy, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. He smirked, leaning back. Relax. Dad's got more money than he knows what to do with. Once he's gone, we'll be set for life. The casual way he said it made my skin crawl. Richard noticed too. He didn't say much in front of Evan, but one night after my husband had disappeared to a poker game, he knocked softly on my office door. I'm sorry you're seeing this side of him, Richard said quietly. He's always been impatient. Wants the reward without the work. I tried to brush it off. He's just going through a phase. Maybe he'll settle down. Richard's eyes, so like Evan's but older and wiser, held mine. I've been telling myself that for 39 years. You can't change someone who doesn't want to change. The following weekend, my unease deepened. I passed by the den and heard Evan's voice, low but smug, talking to his friend on the phone. Just waiting for Dad to kick it and I'll be swimming in cash, he said with a laugh. The words hit me like cold water. My hands tightened around the laundry basket I was carrying, and for a moment I considered storming in. But something told me not to. At least not yet. I went upstairs, closed the bedroom door, and sat on the edge of the bed, my mind spinning. Richard deserved better than to have his only son circling like a vulture. And as for me, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever was coming, I needed to be ready. It was late on a Sunday afternoon when Richard called me into his study. The sun was low, streaming through the tall windows in golden slants, lighting up the dust motes that swirled in the air. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old leather, a scent I'd come to associate with him. Evan had gone out for the day. Something about closing a deal, though I suspected it was just another round of drinks and bragging with his friends. Richard waited until I'd taken the seat across from his desk before he spoke. Clara, he began, his voice steady but carrying a weight I hadn't heard before. I need to tell you something I've never told Evan, and I'm trusting you to keep it until the time is right. My stomach tightened. Of course. What is it? He opened a desk drawer and pulled out a thick folder, sliding it toward me. Inside were financial statements, legal documents, and a set of loan agreements, each stamped and signed. You've heard Evan talk about my estate, Richard said with a faint, tired smile. $450 million. He's convinced it's sitting in a vault somewhere, just waiting for him. But the truth is, that money is already spoken for. I flipped through the documents, my eyes catching on a number so large it almost didn't register. This is collateral? Richard nodded. Every cent of it. I used the estate as collateral for a project I believed in, a network of 5 community health centers along the coast. Free care, rehabilitation programs, job training. It was supposed to be my legacy. His expression darkened. But the land deals turned ugly, legal challenges, environmental lawsuits, delays that drained the reserves. If I don't see the project through before I'm gone, the bank will take it all to settle the debt. I sat back, trying to process. So, if something happens to you, there will be nothing left for Evan to inherit, Richard finished for me. Except maybe the house, if the bank doesn't take that too. I thought about Evan's smug grin, the way he talked about waiting for his father to die. He had no idea the fortune he was counting on was nothing more than a mirage. Why not tell him? I asked. Richard gave a short, humorless laugh. Because he won't believe me. He's never cared enough to understand how money really works. All he sees are dollar signs. He leaned forward, his eyes locking on mine. But I trust you. If the time comes, you tell him the truth. And make sure he hears it. I nodded slowly, the weight of his request settling over me like a heavy coat. I will, I promised. Richard smiled faintly, almost in relief before leaning back in his chair. Good. Now let's keep this between us. For now. As I left the study, the folder's images burned into my mind. I knew the day I'd have to use this knowledge was coming sooner than either of us wanted. Richard's passing was as sudden as it was cruel. One moment he was teasing me about overcooking the cornbread at dinner, and the next morning I found him slumped in his study chair, a book still open in his lap. The paramedics said it was a massive heart attack. Quick, painless. But the shock hit me like a wave I couldn't outrun. The house felt wrong without him. Too quiet in some corners, too hollow in others. The grandfather clock in the hall kept ticking, oblivious, as if time itself hadn't noticed what had been taken from us. I spent the next 3 days coordinating the funeral, fielding calls from distant relatives, and arranging a memorial at the church Richard had attended since boyhood. Evan, meanwhile, was conspicuously absent for most of it, claiming to be handling legal matters. I didn't have the energy to question him. Not yet. On the evening after the burial, I was in the kitchen putting away leftover food from the reception when I heard his footsteps. Heavy. Purposeful. He came in wearing that smirk I had grown to despise. "Clara," he said, tossing a thick envelope onto the counter. "We need to talk." I looked at the envelope, already knowing what it contained. "Divorce papers," he said, almost gleeful. "I don't need you anymore. Dad's estate is worth $450 million. I'm set for life." I stared at him, my hands still resting on the lid of a casserole dish. There was no grief in his face, no sadness for the man we'd just buried. Only hunger, raw and ugly. "Is that all you have to say about your father?" I asked quietly. His smirk deepened. "I've been waiting a long time for this. Don't take it personally. You'll be fine. You always land on your feet." I took a slow breath, remembering Richard's words in the study. If the time comes, you tell him the truth. But it wasn't the time. Not yet. Without a word, I wiped my hands on a towel, walked over to the envelope, and slid the papers out. I signed them with a pen from the junk drawer, my signature looping steadily across the page. No hesitation. "File them yourself," I said, pushing the papers back toward him. "And send my belongings when you're done." For the first time, his expression faltered. Just a flicker. Gone in an instant. I grabbed my purse from the hook by the back door and stepped into the humid Savannah night. The scent of the river drifted on the breeze, mingling with the far-off sound of a cargo ship's horn. I didn't look back at the house. Without Richard, it wasn't a home. It was just a cage with expensive drapes. Evan thought he had won, that he had finally cashed in on a lifetime of waiting. But I knew better. 3 days after I left the Whitfield estate, I was sitting in a quiet corner of a riverside cafe, nursing a cup of coffee and scanning rental listings on my laptop. The weight in my chest had begun to ease. The world felt strangely open, like a door I hadn't realized was locked had just swung wide. My phone buzzed against the table. Evan's name lit up the screen. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. But curiosity, sharp and cold, won out. "Clara." His voice blasted through the line before I could say hello. "What the hell did you do?" I leaned back in my chair, keeping my tone even. "What's going on, Evan?" "They won't give me the money," he shouted. "I went to the bank to transfer Dad's funds, and they told me it's locked. $450 million frozen. Some crap about collateral. What does that even mean?" I let the silence hang for a beat, then said, "It means your father wasn't sitting on a pile of cash for you to burn through. It means everything you thought you were inheriting was already committed to something bigger than you." "What are you talking about?" His voice cracked. Richard used the entire estate as collateral for his community health project. 5 centers along the coast, remember? Except the land deals got tied up in legal disputes. If he passed before they were resolved, the bank would take the funds to settle the debt. There was a stunned pause. "So, you're saying there's nothing?" I glanced out the window at the glinting river. "There's $70,000 in a separate account. That's what's yours. Plus, whatever personal effects you care to keep." 70,000. His voice was hollow now. "That's it? That's all I get?" "That's all you get," I said simply. His breath came fast, jagged. "I spent everything I had. Clara, I thought—" "You thought wrong," I cut in. "You spent my savings, ignored your father's values, and treated his death like a payday. Now you can live with that choice." There was a sound on the other end, halfway between a sob and a curse, then, "Please, we can fix this. Just come back. We'll start over. You've got money, a job. Peace, I've got nothing now." I closed my eyes for a moment, hearing Richard's voice in my memory. "Don't let my boy drag you down." "No, Evan," I said, my tone final. You made your bed. Now lie in it. I hung up before he could answer. My hands were steady as I set the phone down, but my heart felt lighter than it had in years. Some storms you didn't fight in the middle. You waited for the right wind. And now it had finally come. A week after that phone call, a small envelope arrived at the front desk of the temporary apartment I was renting. My name was written in Richard's neat, deliberate handwriting. Inside was a cashier's check for $30,000 and a short note in his voice, even from the grave. For Clara, thank you for understanding what matters. Build something worth keeping. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long while, turning the note over in my hands. $30,000 wasn't a fortune, but coming from Richard, it felt like gold. Not because of the amount, but because of the trust behind it. I used the money to put a down payment on a small condo overlooking the Savannah River. It wasn't grand, but the balcony caught the morning light, and I could hear the soft lapping of the water at night. I filled it with my own choices. Bookshelves lined with travel guides, plants in mismatched pots, and a kitchen table I found at a flea market and restored myself. At work, I threw myself into new projects, but I also carved out time to volunteer with a local health outreach program. It wasn't one of Richard's planned clinics, but it carried the same spirit, helping people who had nowhere else to go. Every time I walked into that building, I felt like a small piece of his vision had survived. I never heard much about Evan after that. Through whispers from mutual acquaintances, I learned he'd burned through the $70,000 in less than 6 months, bouncing from one failed scheme to another. He was living in a rental on the edge of town now, driving a secondhand sedan. The arrogance in his voice the last time we spoke had been replaced with something else. Quiet, maybe even regret, but that was his road to walk. Not mine. Sometimes on cool evenings, I stand on my balcony with a cup of tea and watch the cargo ships glide past, their lights twinkling in the dusk. I think about Richard's steady gaze, his belief that money was a tool, not a trophy. The lesson is simple, but it's one people like Evan may never learn. Wealth isn't the number in your bank account. It's the legacy you leave, the respect you earn, and the lives you touch. I'm not the woman who sat in that living room, blindsided by a man who thought my worth ended when his windfall began. I am Clara Whitfield, and I am building something worth keeping. One day, one choice, one quiet victory at a time.